Hello everyone, it's the Metal Geek. How you all doing? Despite what it may look like, there are very few games in the history of video games that really stand the test of time. Whether they be good games or bad games, some live on forever, some fall into obscurity. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite games. And that game is Parasite Eve. Released in the late 1990s, Parasite Eve is a horror RPG from Square Enix, or at the time known as Squaresoft. The cinematic RPG, they called it. An extension of what they had already achieved on Final Fantasy VII. Now, when this game came out back in the late 90s, full motion video was a huge deal. It was something that we had never seen before. It was something that was growing, becoming a major part of the gaming industry. And Square Enix, again Squaresoft at the time, was at the forefront of that. Now what makes Parasite Eve even more interesting is that while it is an RPG, also a survival horror game. And that's because, while again this is a role-playing game, a traditional Japanese or JRPG, what makes this special is they took a lot of things from games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and they married them together to create a survival horror RPG. This game, while not fully under the radar, isn't as well remembered as games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, or many JRPGs of its time, because maybe it was so different that not many people quite understood it, or maybe it was just always destined to be a cult classic. This is my review of Parasite Eve for the original PlayStation. Let's get to it. What makes Parasite Eve so special is that it was during a time when gaming companies were willing to really take a risk. They wanted to try something new. They wanted to stand out. And in order to do that, you had to be willing to take those risks. Squaresoft was not a company in the 90s that wanted to play it safe. Despite what we may know about them today, they were willing to take those risks on the PlayStation 1. In fact, just moving over to the original PlayStation and away from Nintendo was already a major change for the company. While Final Fantasy VI and other Square RPGs were certainly successes, Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 is what broke the mold for the company. And once that happened, the doors were open. So come the late 90s, after the success of earlier PlayStation 1 Squaresoft RPGs comes Parasite Eve. Riding on the heels of other popular RPGs of that time, as well as the survival horror genre, pioneered largely by Resident Evil. Could Square marry those two genres together very successfully, or was it going to be a massive bust? Well, this is my thoughts. The story takes place around Christmas time, late 1990s, in New York City. It follows the protagonist, Aya Bria, as she tries to unravel the mysteries of a mysterious creature called Eve. Now, I won't go too heavily into the story, but generally, Eve is a parasite, hence the name Parasite Eve. She is able to control and manipulate the mitochondria in the human body, and hence not only take over the human race, but can eradicate them at her leisure. And for whatever reason, Aya seems to have a connection with Eve. To what extent? Well, that's part of the mystery. As for Aya as a character, she's a New York City cop, and she's also kind of a loner. She doesn't tend to connect with people very well, though she does try. In fact, the game does start with her going out on a date to Carnegie Hall to see an opera that goes very, very, very wrong. Yeah, I would have to say that when your date is nearly crispy fried on the very first date, it probably was not a successful date. And this is what kicks off the whole story, with Aya trying to figure out exactly what happened, why she wasn't turned into crispy bacon in the process as well, and why everything seems to be a little bit familiar to her. The game continues to hint throughout that something had happened to her as a kid, that there was some sort of connection with her and Eve right from the time that she was a child. What really makes Parasite Eve such a great game is that the story keeps you going and wanting more throughout. You want to figure out this mystery. You want to know what is going on with Aya and how she is connected to Eve and how all of that kind of comes together. But the game can't be just story. I mean, it can be. There's plenty of great, like, choose your own adventure type of games or graphic novels out there. But in this case, we're talking about an RPG, a role-playing game. So, if the gameplay isn't there, then does the game hold up? What makes Parasite Eve, again, so unique is that while it is a JRPG, again, it borrows aspects from the survival horror genre. Now, one of the main staples of RPGs is the inventory system. They pretty much all have them. But unlike most RPGs, especially of the time, the inventory system was incredibly limited. Now, there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is because, well, this is where it's borrowing from survival horror. Survival horror games, especially looking at like Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 and pretty much that entire series, has very limited inventory storage. Now, mind you, Parasite Eve has a much larger inventory storage than pretty much any survival horror game of its time. But it significantly cut the inventory down in order to kind of give it a little bit more of that survival horror feel. Like, I can only hold this many bullets, I can only hold this many weapons, I can only hold this many healing items. And at first, while that may seem limiting, which is kind of the idea, by the end game, it doesn't really affect you all that much. The game incorporates an upgrade system, and as you upgrade, you can make certain guns and blunt weapons and all that stronger by combining them with other weapons and tools and making them, well, stronger. As your weapons get stronger, and there is a point where your weapons get extremely strong, you're wiping everything out towards the end of the game. In fact, the end game is, I want to say, not overly easy, but it is pretty much incredibly easy up until you get to pretty much Eve herself. And once you get to Eve, even that could be easy depending on how you leveled. Now here's the trick. Once you reach level 38 in Parasite Eve, which does take quite a bit of time, but once you get to level 38, I don't know if it was an oversight by the company itself, if it was left in there on purpose, but suddenly leveling up to the next level, it goes from hundreds of thousands of experience points down to just a few thousand each round. That means every level is only like 3,000 or 4,000 experience points to reach the next level. So once you reach level 38, you can level your character up to like level 80, 90, even level 99 in the matter of hours. And I'm not even talking about lots of hours. I'm talking maybe 5-6 hours. You could go from level 38 up to like level 85. That makes fighting Eve at the end incredibly easy, because you are now a powerhouse. You got powerful weapons, you got plenty of ammo, and you're doing tons of damage. To be honest with you, the level 38 leveling trick kind of breaks the game. But that's also only if you have the patience to do it, because it takes a while to get up to level 38. With that said, Parasite Eve isn't an incredibly long game, and this is where it again borrows more from the survival horror side of its genre splice. And that is, it's right around 10 to 14 hours long, and that really depends on how much time you want to put into the leveling. And that's short for an RPG, but that's pretty long, or at least pretty decently long, at least at that time, and even now, for a survival horror game. It kind of flies through its story at a really good brisk pace. It doesn't like leave you hanging for too long, but it keeps the mystery going just long enough. Therefore, it doesn't outstay its welcome. It tells its story, it moves on, and you've had a really good gaming experience. And then if you want to add on those extra few hours and pump your character up into the level 70s or 80s, which again kind of breaks the end game, but it also kind of makes you feel like a badass because you're just tearing through everything, then there's plenty of gaming experience to be had with this game. So it's not an overly short game, but it's also not an incredibly long one. It's not Final Fantasy VII that takes between 35 and 65 hours depending on how many side quests you do. But of course, what all of this does mean is that the game is a little bit linear. There is a little bit of exploration, and there is even an optional area you can go to that you can totally skip if you want. But it's pretty straightforward. There's really only one path to go, and you pretty much have to take that path, and you pretty much have to go down that narrative road. In today's open world games, that may seem like a bad thing, but that's not always a bad thing. There are different types of games, and there are different types of experiences. So if you are looking for a more open world experience, a lot more exploration, Parasite Eve may not be for you. But if you want an excellent narrative that knows how to go from point A to point B, you should pick this game up and play it. It is available in several different formats right now. I have the original disc, but you can also download and play it on the PlayStation 3. And I'm sure there are other ways, but we'll not get into that. The gameplay itself is a hybrid of survival horror and turn-based action RPG. When in general exploration, you are kind of moving around more like a survival horror game, and with the controls being a little less tank-like than, say, Resident Evil. Unlike survival horror, the battles are not in real time. They are random encounters like an RPG. So basically that means you're just walking around and then out of the blue, poof, you're in a battle. It's the traditional trope of JRPGs. But once you're in the battle and you're pretty much using the same space that you were walking around in, it doesn't really change into a whole new battle screen, say like Final Fantasy VII. It's pretty much real time at that point. You're moving around, you're shooting on your own, although there is an active time battle meter, which means you can't perform certain actions until that meter fills up. And that's the RPG element of it. The survival horror element of it is being able to move around and shoot and dodge and all of that. And those two kind of come together to create this survival horror RPG, or again, as Squaresoft called it, the cinematic RPG. Now, why is it so cinematic? Well, because of this. Cinematics everywhere. This game was touted to be the first major cinematic RPG. It was trying to give you a movie experience. Now, mind you, there are games that pretty much did it first. Again, Final Fantasy VII, and more action-oriented games like Metal Gear Solid, but this took it to a whole new level, at least at that time. And the cinematics in this game are gorgeous, and so are the graphics, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But these cinematics were top notch. Now, yeah, they don't hold a candle to even real-time cinematics that appear in games today, like Uncharted, or The Last of Us, or The Last of Us 2, or any of those games. But in 1997, 1998, this was amazing. This was completely something new. This was only a few years old. These big cinematic experiences in video games. And Squaresoft spared no expense at making these cinematics pop. They are action-packed. They are dramatic. They have some very horrifying imagery, and if you're watching this scene, I apologize if it gives you nightmares, but it was amazing. Now, do they hold up today? Like I said, they don't hold a candle to today's stuff. But for what they are, they still hold up pretty well. And so do the in-game graphics. While Final Fantasy VII is not the first game to use pre-rendered backgrounds, it is one of the first major games to use it in a major way. And during the PlayStation era, Squaresoft became all but obsessed with pre-rendered backgrounds. And these backgrounds, especially for the time, look amazing. Now, Aya herself and the other characters are polygonal characters. And they are jaggy, they don't hold up that well. It is definitely a PlayStation 1 game. All in all, Parasite Eve is one of my favorite games. It came at a really exciting time in gaming when there were companies that were just willing to do a lot of experimentation to get the best possible games they could. Parasite Eve went on to spawn 2 sequels, Parasite Eve 2 for the PlayStation 1, which dropped most of the RPG elements in favor of a straightforward survival horror game. And then there was Third Birthday for the PSP, which dropped the Parasite Eve name, I think largely because they had lost the copyright to use the Parasite Eve title. The game in of itself is based off of a Japanese horror novel written by Hideki Senna. And there's even a movie adaptation of the story as well. But for me, the game has always been my personal experience with this story. There was never anything like it before, and there has never been anything like it since. And that's why this game is so special. It hasn't been forgotten. It's not super obscure, but it has never been remembered quite as well as it deserves to be. Parasite Eve gets a 9.8 out of 10. And this is the Metal Geek saying,